Hey guys, tonight we'll be exploring the long and fascinating history of Israel, a story that stretches from the dawn of civilization to the bustling, complex modern nation we know today. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the kind of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know, from where are you watching? And what time is it for you right now? It's time now to dim the lights and let's cover what we have for tonight together. Before there was a nation, before the word Israel ever echoed through human language, there was simply a land, rugged, sun-scorched, and ancient beyond imagination. The land that would one day host one of the world's most powerful stories was once just a stretch of earth between greater empires, a narrow corridor that bridged Africa and Asia. It was not vast like Egypt, nor mighty like Mesopotamia. It was a crossroads, and like all crossroads, it would witness the meeting of traders, conquerors, prophets, and dreamers. Geographically, the territory we call Israel lies on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, bordered by deserts to the south and east, and by fertile valleys to the north. It's a land of contrasts, mountains and lowlands, arid wilderness, and green pastures, each influencing how people lived and moved. Thousands of years before the emergence of Hebrew tribes, this region was already a cradle of human settlement. Archaeologists have found evidence of prehistoric communities, here dating back hundreds of thousands of years, from stone tools scattered in caves of Mount Carmel to ancient bones that tell stories of early hominids who hunted and gathered long before recorded history began. By around 10,000 BCE, after the Ice Age began to loosen its grip, something remarkable started happening across the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land that stretched from Mesopotamia through the Levant and down to Egypt. People began to plant seeds, domesticate animals, and settle permanently. Villages emerged near rivers and springs, the most famous of which was Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Its walls, dating back over 9,000 years, still whisper of humanity's first steps toward civilization. Imagine that, a walled settlement standing where the Jordan Valley opens, surrounded by date palms and watchful eyes. Long before the Israelites or the Canaanites, people were already building, farming, trading, and worshiping here. As centuries passed, the land that would one day be Israel became a hub of early innovation. The Neolithic Revolution brought pottery, weaving, and trade. Stone was carved into idols, symbols of fertility and life. Clay tablets in neighboring lands began to carry the first written words, and though literacy hadn't yet reached this small region, the winds of civilization were blowing strongly. Every traveler, merchant, and migrant who passed through left a trace, a word, a custom, a seed. Around 3000 BCE, the age of great city-states began. To the east, Sumerians built their ziggurats under the blazing Mesopotamian sun. To the west, Egyptians raised pyramids that scraped the heavens, and between them lay this modest strip of land, a link in the chain of communication and trade. Caravans laden with spices, metals, and fabrics wound through its valleys, while along the Mediterranean coast, sailors docked at small ports that would one day become ancient cities like Jaffa and Acre. At that time, the region wasn't yet a single country or kingdom. It was a mosaic of small communities, each shaped by geography. In the fertile northern plains, farming villages thrived. In the central highlands, shepherds grazed flocks of sheep and goats. In the arid south, nomads wandered between water sources, following ancient desert trails. The diversity of this landscape bred resilience, a people used to adapting, to surviving between powers greater than themselves. The first known inhabitants to leave their cultural fingerprints on this land were the Canaanites. By around 2000 BCE, they had developed organized city-states, complete with rulers, temples, and fortified walls. The Canaanites were not a single nation, but rather a collection of independent cities, each with its own local deity, customs, and trade networks. They were the true children of the Levant, speaking early Semitic tongues and building their lives on the soil that would later nurture the Israelites. Their cities, Hazor in the north, Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley, and Jerusalem high in the hills, were small but vibrant centers of life. Archaeological layers tell us that Canaanite cities traded extensively with both Egypt and Mesopotamia. In their art, we find Egyptian scarabs, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and local pottery styles blended together. Proof of a culture open to influence, but proud of its own traditions. Egypt, Ever, the giant to the southwest, began to notice this land too. Pharaohs saw Canaan as both a buffer and a bridge. Their armies marched through it on campaigns towards Syria and Mesopotamia, leaving behind monuments carved with hieroglyphs celebrating victories. Egyptian records from as early as the 15th century BCE mention a land called Retinue and Canaan, territories full of restless city kings paying tribute to the pharaoh. Clay tablets discovered at Amarna, Egypt's short-lived capital under Pharaoh Akhenaten, contain letters from Canaanite rulers pleading for military support, complaining about raids from desert tribes called the Habiru, a word that some scholars believe might have linguistic ties to Hebrew. If true, this would be one of the earliest traces of the people who would one day be known as Israel. But in this early age, Israel did not yet exist. The land was a patchwork quilt of peoples and tongues: Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, and nomadic tribes who moved with the seasons. Each group had its gods, its shrines, its sense of destiny. They worshipped in open-air sanctuaries, at altars of stone, under the shadow of sacred trees. The Canaanite pantheon was vast. Baal, the storm god; El, the father of the gods; Asherah, the mother of fertility. These deities reflected nature's power, the cycles of rain and drought, life and death, and humanity's dependence on forces it could not control. By around 1500 BCE, trade and conflict intertwined more tightly than ever. Bronze tools and weapons became widespread, and with them came wars over land and water. Empires rose and fell around the region, each leaving its mark. The Egyptians held sway for centuries, but their control was always tenuous. When Egypt weakened, new peoples, among them the mysterious sea peoples, moved in from the coasts. The balance of power shifted like desert sand. Meanwhile, high in the hill country, in the rugged ridges of what is now central Israel, small, self-sufficient communities began to take root. These settlements were poor compared to the great coastal cities, but they were fiercely independent. Archaeologists have found evidence of these early highland villages dating to around 200 BCE. Around the same time, Egyptian records mention a people called Israel for the first time on a stone inscription known as the Merneptah Stele. Pharaoh Merneptah boasts of defeating several enemies in Canaan, among them a people he calls Israel. It's a small mention, just a few carved lines, but it's monumental. It tells us that by the late 13th century BCE, Israel was already recognized as a distinct people, living somewhere within Canaan. They were not yet a kingdom, not yet the Israel of David and Solomon, but they existed, a community with a name. That, perhaps, is the most profound moment in this section of the story. A name, Israel, appearing in stone over 3,200 years ago. It's like catching the first glimpse of a silhouette forming in the fog of prehistory. The people were real, their presence known even to their powerful neighbors. From that moment, the story of Israel becomes traceable through battles and beliefs, migrations and memories, all unfolding on the same stretch of land that had already seen millennia of human history. So, before Israel was a nation, before the prophets and kings, before the faiths that would one day look back on it as sacred ground, this land was already ancient. It had seen cities rise and crumble, gods praised and forgotten, and empires come and go. The soil of Israel is not just earth, it's a palimpsest of civilizations, each writing its own chapter, each leaving faint traces for the next. And from these early roots, from the deserts, the hills, and the river valleys, the story of Israel begins to take shape. Long before the Hebrew tribes carved their stories into history, before a people called Israel took shape, the land was Canaan, a collection of fortified cities, fertile fields, and rugged highlands ruled by kings who paid tribute to faraway empires. The Canaanites were not outsiders to this land. They were its heartbeat. For centuries, they built upon its soil, drew water from its springs, and raised walls of stone that stood against time and invaders alike. To understand Israel's beginnings, one must first understand Canaan, for Israel was born out of Canaanite soil, not as an alien culture, but as one that evolved from it, reshaped by faith and circumstance. Canaan stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River Valley, roughly encompassing modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan. It was a land of diversity, geographically, linguistically, and politically. The Canaanites were Semitic peoples, closely related in language and culture to their neighbors in Mesopotamia and Syria. They spoke dialects that modern scholars call Northwest Semitic, the linguistic ancestors of Hebrew and Phoenician. Their cities dotted the map like bright stars: Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, Lachish, and Jerusalem among them, each ruled by a local king, each with its own gods, armies, and ambitions. To the casual observer, Canaan might have seemed insignificant compared to Egypt's pyramids or Mesopotamia's ziggurats, but this small corridor was strategically priceless. Whoever controlled Canaan controlled the trade routes that linked the great civilizations of the ancient world. Caravans carrying spices from Arabia, copper from Cyprus, and gold from Nubia passed through its valleys. Ships hugged its coastline, stopping at bustling ports like Byblos and Ugarit. This constant movement of goods, ideas, and travelers made Canaan a melting pot Long before the phrase existed, archaeological discoveries reveal that the Canaanites were master craftsmen and traders. Their pottery, elegant in shape and design, spread across the eastern Mediterranean. They worked with bronze and copper, built palaces with plastered floors, and carved idols from stone and ivory. They adopted writing from the Mesopotamians, using cuneiform to record treaties, trade, and politics. Yet, the most significant Canaanite innovation would be the alphabet, a system of writing far simpler than cuneiform or hieroglyphs. The earliest known alphabetic inscriptions, found in Sinai and later Canaan, date to around 1800 BCE. This revolutionary idea, using symbols to represent individual sounds, would evolve into the Phoenician alphabet and, from there, into Greek, Latin, and eventually the letters you're reading now. In a quiet way, the Canaanites helped shape how humanity writes and remembers. Their religion was deeply connected to nature. The Canaanites saw divinity in the cycles of the seasons, in the thunder that brought rain, in the fertility of the soil. Their pantheon was vast, ruled by El, the father of gods, a wise, elder figure who presided over divine councils. His consort, Asherah, was a mother goddess, nurturing, protective, often symbolized by a tree or wooden pole. Then there was Baal, the storm god, fierce and youthful, who rode the clouds and battled the forces of chaos to bring rain and life. There were others too: Anat, the warrior goddess; Mot, the god of death; Dagon, associated with grain and agriculture. These myths weren't just stories, they were reflections of the people's relationship with the unpredictable natural world around them. When rains failed or enemies invaded, it wasn't just politics, it was cosmic warfare among the gods. Rituals were central to Canaanite life. Temples stood on high places, often built from stone and open to the sky. Sacrifices of animals, grain, wine, and occasionally humans were offered to appease deities. Excavations at Canaanite sites have uncovered altars stained with ash and bones, libation vessels and idols, sometimes small enough to fit in one's hand, suggesting that worship was both public and personal. Religion was not confined to temples. It permeated every act of existence. A farmer's success depended on Baal's favor. A family's fertility was tied to Asherah's blessing. The divine was always near, both comforting and terrifying. Yet the Canaanites were not isolated in their beliefs. Their culture absorbed influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Egyptian amulets have been found in Canaanite graves. Babylonian myths echo in Canaanite literature. The most famous texts come from the ancient city of Ugarit, located in modern Syria but culturally Canaanite. Discovered in the 20th century, the Ugaritic tablets reveal a sophisticated religious worldview and provide the closest literary background to the later Hebrew Bible. In these stories, we see early versions of themes that will echo through Israelite religion: the struggle between life and death, order and chaos, divine kingship and rebellion. Politically, Canaan was fragmented. Each city-state acted as its own kingdom, led by a ruler who controlled surrounding villages. Power often changed hands through warfare, alliances, and tribute. Larger empires like Egypt saw these city-states as vassals. During the 14th century BCE, many Canaanite kings wrote letters to the Egyptian pharaoh, preserved today in the Amarna letters, begging for troops, reporting on local unrest, or accusing their rivals of treachery. Through these clay tablets, we hear their voices across millennia, anxious, desperate, and calculating. They mention raids by mysterious groups called the Habiru, perhaps mercenaries, perhaps displaced tribes, roaming the countryside and destabilizing cities. Whether these Habiru were ancestors of the early Israelites remains debated, but the historical context is striking. Around this same period, the power of Egypt and Canaan began to wane, creating a vacuum that would eventually allow new groups to emerge in the highlands. This weakening of Egyptian control was part of a much larger phenomenon, the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. Around 1200 BCE, the interconnected world of ancient empires began to unravel. Cities from Greece to Anatolia to Canaan were destroyed. Trade routes broke down, and populations migrated. Scholars still debate what caused it: climate change, earthquakes, invasions by the so-called sea peoples, or internal revolts. Whatever the reason, the collapse shattered the old order, and in the ruins of the Canaanite city-states, something new began to grow. That something new would, in time, become the people of Israel. Archaeological surveys show that in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, small unwalled villages began appearing in the central hill country of Canaan, areas that had been sparsely populated before. These communities were different from the old urban Canaanite centers. They lacked palaces and temples. Their pottery was simpler, their houses uniform. They raised sheep and goats, practiced subsistence farming, and avoided pork, a detail that would later mark Israelite dietary law. These settlements represent the quiet birth of a new social and cultural identity, one that would evolve into the Israelite tribes described in the Bible. But it's crucial to understand that this transition wasn't a dramatic replacement of one people by another. The Israelites didn't arrive as foreign conquerors who erased the Canaanites. Rather, they emerged from within the existing population, Canaanites who adapted to new conditions, shaped by shifting politics, economic hardship, and evolving religious beliefs. In many ways, Israel was Canaan reborn, a cultural descendant that took the ancient traditions and refashioned them into something distinct, centered on a single, invisible God. So, when we look back on the Canaanite world, we're not looking at strangers to Israel's story. We're looking at its roots, the languages, the symbols, the moral questions. They all trace back to this fertile, complex culture. The Israelites would later redefine and reject much of Canaanite religion, portraying Baal and Asherah as rivals to their own God. Yet beneath that rejection lies inheritance. Their laws, poetry, and early worldview were carved from the same stone as Canaan's temples. Canaan's legacy, then, is more than archaeological layers and ruined walls. It's the unseen foundation beneath one of the world's most enduring civilizations. It's the prelude to a story that would reshape faith, politics, and culture across continents. And though the Canaanites themselves eventually vanished as a distinct people, their spirit endures in language, in myth, and in the very soil of Israel, where every step is a step across their forgotten kingdom. Every great nation, every civilization that has endured begins not merely with a war or a king, but with an idea, a story that defines who its people believe themselves to be. For Israel, that story begins with a single man standing beneath the vast Mesopotamian sky, listening to a voice that promised him the impossible. His name was Abraham. The figure of Abraham sits at the crossroads of history and faith. For the world's three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, he is the father of belief, the man who dared to trust an unseen God. But in historical terms, he also represents the beginning of a journey, a migration that connected ancient Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan and laid the foundations for what would one day become Israel. To understand Abraham's world, we must travel back to around 2000 BCE, deep into the Bronze Age, to the bustling cities of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. The story, according to the biblical account, begins in Ur of the Chaldees, one of the great city-states of the ancient Near East. Ur was a marvel of its time, mud brick ziggurats rising toward the heavens, markets filled with traders selling wool, copper, and lapis lazuli, and priests serving a pantheon of gods led by the moon deity Nana. The people of Ur were sophisticated, literate, and deeply religious. They lived within an ordered universe defined by countless rituals and divine hierarchies. And then there was Abraham, known first as Abram, son of Terah. The Bible offers no great detail about his early life, but what it does say changes everything. Abram heard a call, a voice, one unlike the many gods worshipped in Ur, told him to leave his homeland, to abandon his father's house, and to journey to a land that I will show you. In return, this mysterious deity promised to make Abram into a great nation, to bless him, and to make his name endure. It was an extraordinary idea. The religions of the ancient world were local. Each city had its patron god, each land its divine protector. But here was something new. A single god, claiming dominion not over a city, but over all creation. This god did not demand offerings in a temple or allegiance through fear. Instead, he asked for trust, a covenant built on faith. Abram obeyed, along with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and their household. He departed from Ur and set out northwest along the great trade routes of Mesopotamia. The journey was long, crossing through the rich lands of Haran in what is now southern Turkey, where he stayed for some time before moving south into the land of Canaan. It is there, the Bible says, that the promise was renewed. To your descendants, I will give this land. Imagine what that meant at the time. Abram arrived in a region already inhabited by Canaanites, Amorites, and other peoples, each with their own gods, their own cities, and their own claims to the land. Yet, amid these rival powers, Abram built simple stone altars to a god no one else knew, altars that marked the spots where faith touched earth. Archaeologists have found remains of early nomadic encampments in the same regions described in Genesis, near Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron. These were not empires or cities, but tents, wells, and livestock, the life of a herdsman, transient yet purposeful. This was the beginning of something quietly revolutionary, a people defined not by land or king, but by a promise. In the ancient world, where power was measured in territory and monuments, Abram's faith was invisible. Yet, over time, it would outlast every empire. The story of Abraham is not just about faith, though. It's also about struggle, about the human tension between doubt and devotion. The biblical narrative portrays him as deeply human. He questions, he fears, he negotiates with God. When famine strikes Canaan, he goes to Egypt seeking food. When danger looms, he arms his men and rescues Lot from enemy kings. He is not a passive mystic. He is a leader, shrewd and courageous, balancing survival and faith in a brutal world. One of the most significant moments in his story is the covenant of the pieces, described in Genesis 15. In this episode, Abram is told that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars, but they will first endure 4 centuries of oppression before inheriting the promised land. To seal this promise, God instructs Abram to prepare a ritual sacrifice. As night falls, a deep sleep overtakes him, and a vision appears, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passing between the divided pieces of the offering. In ancient culture, this act symbolized the sealing of a covenant, a binding contract between a deity and a mortal. But here, something remarkable happens. Only God passes through the sacrifice. It is a one-sided promise. In other words, God takes full responsibility for its fulfillment. This covenant became the cornerstone of Israel's identity. It wasn't a political pact or an alliance among tribes. It was a divine contract that defined a people through faith rather than geography. Centuries later, prophets and kings would look back on it as the very foundation of Israel's existence. Another key episode is the renaming of Abram and Sarai. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared again, reaffirming the promise and changing their names to Abraham and Sarah, names that meant father of many and princess. This renaming was symbolic. It represented transformation, a new destiny. Abraham would no longer be simply a wanderer. He would be the ancestor of nations. Then came the most personal test, the long-awaited birth of a son. For years, Abraham and Sarah had no children, and in their desperation, Sarah urged Abraham to have a child with her maidservant, Hagar. The result was Ishmael, regarded in Islamic tradition as Abraham's firstborn and the ancestor of Arab peoples. But years later, Sarah herself gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. Through Isaac, the covenant lineage would continue. Yet the story takes a darker, more profound turn in the binding of Isaac, one of the most haunting passages in all of Scripture. God commands Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice. It's an unbearable test, one that pits faith against morality, obedience against love. At the last moment, an angel intervenes, stopping Abraham's hand and providing a ram in Isaac's place. The message, interpreted countless ways through the ages, seems to be that faith does not require human sacrifice, but complete trust. In that act, Abraham's covenant is renewed once more, not through words, but through action. From a historical perspective, some scholars debate whether Abraham was a literal figure or a symbolic one, a composite memory of early Semitic migrations into Canaan. Ancient records show that groups of nomads, known as Amorites, moved westward from Mesopotamia during this period, bringing with them new languages and customs. Abraham's journey may reflect those real movements, a memory of tribes who left the great cities of the East to seek new lands under the open sky. Whether historical or legendary, the story of Abraham captures a profound human truth: the courage to leave behind certainty for the sake of purpose. As the generations passed, Abraham's descendants, through Isaac and his son Jacob, would inherit not just land, but the vision that began with him. They would remember that their identity was not born of conquest, but of calling. The covenant was more than a promise of land. It was a moral and spiritual blueprint, a belief that there was one God, above kings and empires, who demanded righteousness, justice, and compassion. In the quiet sands of Canaan, the world had changed forever. No monuments were built to mark Abraham's journey. No inscriptions were carved into stone. But his story, the idea that a single, unseen God could choose one man to father a nation, would outlive the palaces of Ur, the temples of Babylon, and the pyramids of Egypt. Abraham's footprints may be buried beneath millennia of dust, but his legacy walks beside us still, in scripture, in faith, and in the enduring story of Israel that was just beginning to unfold. Following Abraham's journey of faith, the story of Israel begins to take a sharper shape through his descendants. The narrative moves forward to Isaac, the son of promise, and then to his son Jacob, whose life and actions set the stage for the 12 tribes that would one day form the people of Israel. This section is not just about individuals, but about the emergence of a people, their identity, culture, and early social structure, all rooted in the ancient Near East. Isaac, born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, was the fulfillment of a long-awaited promise. From the outset, his life symbolized continuity, a bridge between Abraham's covenant and the unfolding history of the Israelites. While the biblical account paints Isaac as relatively quiet and contemplative compared to the more dynamic Abraham or Jacob, his life was far from uneventful. He settled in the land of Canaan, carefully navigating relationships with neighboring peoples. The Canaanites, Amorites, and Philistines were all present, each vying for control over water, grazing land, and trade routes. Water was particularly central to Isaac's time. The wells he dug and the disputes surrounding them offer a window into the daily life of a semi-nomadic agrarian society. In a desert-adjacent land, access to water could mean survival or death. The biblical accounts of Isaac reopening the wells dug by Abraham reflect not only familial continuity, but also the importance of sustaining a community in a competitive landscape. These wells were more than physical resources. They symbolized territorial claims, intergenerational inheritance, and social stability. Isaac married Rebekah, a woman whose story, like Abraham's, blends travel, fate, and divine guidance. Her journey from her family's home to Isaac's household mirrors the movement of people in the ancient Near East, where marriages often served to cement alliances between clans. Rebekah bore 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, whose rivalry would profoundly shape the trajectory of Israelite history. Their struggle was not just personal, it symbolized competing ways of life. Esau, the hunter and man of the open fields, representing the nomadic warrior tradition, and Jacob, the quiet, contemplative figure, reflecting a future centered on family cohesion, strategy, and faith. Jacob's story is one of cunning, ambition, and divine encounters. He famously acquired his brother Esau's birthright and blessing, securing the spiritual and social inheritance that would flow through his lineage. Jacob's journey to his uncle Laban's household in Haran exemplifies the long-distance migrations common in the Bronze Age. where extended kinship networks spread across the Fertile Crescent. While there, Jacob amassed wealth, marrying sisters Leah and Rachel, and gathering livestock and followers. The biblical account of Jacob's labor agreements, cunning exchanges, and eventual return to Canaan highlights the practical and strategic considerations of family and tribal leadership in a pre-state society. One of the most defining episodes in Jacob's life was his encounter at Peniel, where he wrestled with a mysterious figure through the night. When dawn broke, Jacob emerged with a new name, Israel, meaning he who struggles with God. This moment symbolizes the complex interplay of human agency, divine guidance, and identity formation. The name Israel would not only identify Jacob himself, but his descendants, the 12 tribes, and eventually an entire nation. Jacob fathered 12 sons, each becoming the patriarch of a tribe. These 12 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, formed the structural foundation of Israelite society. They were not merely family units, but political and social entities, each with its own territory, strengths, and responsibilities. This tribal structure reflected the broader socio-political organization of the ancient Near East, where clans and kin groups operated semi-autonomously, yet were bound by shared ancestry and common law. The tribes were also deeply connected to the land. Early settlement patterns, inferred from archaeology, show that families clustered in areas suitable for both herding and agriculture. The central highlands of Canaan were particularly attractive to these emerging Israelite communities, providing defensible terrain, fertile valleys, and access to trade routes without immediate domination by larger Canaanite city-states. This geography would later influence military strategies, migration patterns, and even the spiritual imagination of the Israelites, who saw mountains, hills, and rivers as places of covenantal significance. The story of Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, is especially pivotal. Sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, Joseph rose to prominence in Egypt, eventually becoming the Pharaoh's chief administrator. His journey illustrates the fluidity of identity and survival in the ancient world, where displacement could lead to power as much as peril. Joseph's story also introduces themes of diplomacy, famine management, and international relations, demonstrating that the Israelites' history was intertwined with larger regional dynamics. His eventual reconciliation with his family facilitated the migration of Jacob's household into Egypt, a critical step in the formation of Israelite identity outside of Canaan. The migration into Egypt did not erase the Israelites' connection to Canaan. Oral traditions, familial narratives, and ritual practices ensured that the memory of the land persisted. By maintaining these connections, the tribes established a sense of continuity that would define them as a people. Their identity was rooted not only in ancestry and covenant, but also in shared experience, adaptation to new environments, and the integration of survival strategies learned over generations. The formation of the 12 tribes also had lasting implications for governance, law, and religion. Each tribe developed internal hierarchies, led by elders or heads of families, responsible for decision-making, resource management, and conflict resolution. The tribal system provided flexibility and resilience, essential in a region frequently disrupted by migration, conquest, and environmental challenges. These social structures would later influence Israel's legal and spiritual frameworks, including practices codified in the Torah. Religious identity during this period was evolving alongside social organization. While early Israelites inherited cultural and religious elements from their Canaanite environment, they began to develop distinctive practices that emphasized a singular covenantal God. Rituals, dietary rules, and the oral transmission of sacred narratives helped consolidate tribal cohesion. In particular, the idea of chosenness, that these 12 tribes were selected to carry forward a divine promise, created a shared sense of purpose and destiny that reinforced social bonds across generations. In sum, the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 sons form the backbone of early Israelite identity. These figures are both historical and symbolic, representing the migration, adaptation, and consolidation of a people within a dynamic landscape. From Isaac's careful stewardship of land and resources to Jacob's strategic alliances and divine encounters, to Joseph's integration into Egyptian society, the foundations of Israel were being laid. The 12 tribes would carry forward this legacy, eventually leaving Egypt in the Exodus and establishing themselves in the Promised Land. But their roots, familial, geographic, and spiritual, were firmly planted in the narratives and realities of this formative period. Through these stories, we begin to see Israel not merely as a biblical construct, but as a socio-cultural phenomenon emerging from the interplay of kinship, environment, and faith. The tribe's cohesion, flexibility, and memory would allow them to survive centuries of displacement, conquest, and exile. And as we move forward in history, we will witness how these 12 distinct yet united tribes evolved into a nation, navigating challenges and opportunities across the complex tapestry of the ancient Near East. The story of Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, is not only one of family drama and divine providence, but also a story that bridges two worlds: the early Israelites and the mighty civilization of Egypt. It is a tale of migration, survival, political acumen, and the long-term shaping of a people whose history would later center on both the land of Canaan and the Nile Valley. Joseph was Jacob's favorite, a son born late in his life to Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. This favoritism was symbolized by the famous coat of many colors, a garment that set Joseph apart and marked him as special, perhaps even threatening, in the eyes of his brothers. The biblical account emphasizes Joseph's dreams, which foretold his family bowing before him. Whether seen as prophecy or arrogance, these dreams exacerbated sibling jealousy. The story quickly escalates. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, who fabricate a tale of his death to hide their betrayal. This event, brutal as it is, becomes the turning point for Israel's long sojourn in Egypt. Joseph is taken south, far from the hills of Canaan, into a land that was at the height of its Middle Kingdom or early New Kingdom periods, a civilization with monumental architecture, centralized bureaucracy, and a rigid social hierarchy. Egypt was both a place of opportunity and danger, a land where foreigners could rise or perish, depending on their cunning, loyalty, and ability to navigate complex social structures. As a slave in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official, Joseph quickly demonstrates intelligence, resourcefulness, and integrity. He earns trust, manages resources efficiently, and rises to a position of responsibility. Yet his journey is far from smooth. Potiphar's wife, captivated or threatened by him, falsely accuses Joseph of attempted assault. This leads to his imprisonment, a reversal that might have ended the story for a less resilient figure. But even in prison, Joseph's abilities shine. He interprets dreams for fellow prisoners, predicting outcomes that demonstrate not just skill, but insight. Dreams, in this ancient context, were serious matters. Both in Egypt and Mesopotamia, dreams were considered messages from the divine, often reflecting the state of society or individual fate. Joseph's reputation as a dream interpreter eventually reaches Pharaoh, who is troubled by his own ominous visions. 7 cows, 7 ears of grain, symbolizing impending years of plenty and famine. Joseph interprets these dreams with remarkable accuracy, predicting 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. His combination of divine insight, practical strategy, and organizational acumen impresses Pharaoh so much that he appoints Joseph as his second in command, a remarkable rise from enslaved outsider to the ruler of Egypt's granaries and resources. Joseph's administration during this period is extraordinary. He centralizes the collection of surplus grain during years of plenty, stores it strategically across Egypt, and prepares for the inevitable famine. This not only saves countless Egyptians from starvation, but also sets the stage for the Israelite migration. Scholars note that this narrative reflects real historical patterns in Egypt, where centralized planning and granary systems were essential to survive fluctuations in the Nile's inundation and seasonal agricultural cycles. Joseph's role, while stylized in scripture, mirrors the historical reality that capable administrators could achieve significant power in Egypt, even as foreigners. The famine itself is critical. It drives Jacob's family to leave Canaan temporarily in search of food, sending his sons to Egypt for the first time. These visits, initially laden with tension and mistrust, eventually lead to Joseph revealing his identity. The reunion is not just a personal reconciliation, it represents the merging of two worlds, the hill country of Canaan and the Nile-dominated Egyptian civilization. Joseph ensures that his family is provided for, settling them in Goshen, a fertile region ideal for pastoralism and farming. Here, the Israelites grow in number and prosperity, maintaining a distinct identity while benefiting from Egypt's economic and administrative structure. This period in Egypt, often called the Sojourn, is crucial for understanding early Israelite society. It introduces themes of migration, adaptation, and survival under foreign rule, patterns that would recur repeatedly in Israel's history. The Israelites remain outsiders, but gain experience in governance, resource management, and diplomacy. The biblical account emphasizes that while they prospered, they remained culturally and religiously distinct, worshiping their God even in a land dominated by Pharaoh and the Egyptian pantheon. Joseph's story also introduces ethical and philosophical dimensions to the narrative. His ability to forgive his brothers after their betrayal demonstrates a commitment to family unity, moral responsibility, and foresight, qualities that would become central to Israelite identity. In the broader historical sense, it reflects how small kinship groups could navigate larger imperial systems, maintain cohesion, and eventually thrive despite initial disadvantage. From an archaeological perspective, while direct evidence of Joseph is debated, Egypt during the Middle and New Kingdoms aligns well with the biblical context. Egyptian records show the presence of Semitic peoples, often referred to as Asiatics, who lived in the Nile Delta, worked as laborers or administrators, and occasionally rose to positions of authority. Settlements in the eastern delta and papyri mentioning grain storage and administration suggest that the scriptural account may reflect real patterns of migration, labor, and social integration during periods of famine and central planning. The Sojourn also establishes long-term geopolitical dynamics. Egypt, a dominant regional power, becomes a haven, a challenge, and a stage for Israel's formative experiences. The Israelites' presence in Goshen foreshadows both collaboration and conflict, themes that will resurface in later centuries during the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and interactions with neighboring empires. Joseph's death, alongside the death of his father Jacob, concludes this chapter of migration and settlement, but leaves a lasting legacy. Before passing, Jacob blesses his sons, prophesying the future of each tribe. These blessings reinforce tribal identity, foreshadow regional patterns, and solidify the connection between ancestry, territory, and divine promise. Joseph himself is embalmed and buried in Egypt, yet he requests that his bones be carried back to Canaan when the Israelites eventually return, a symbolic link between their Egyptian sojourn and their promised homeland. In sum, Joseph's life and the Israelite sojourn in Egypt encapsulate themes that define the early history of Israel: survival amid adversity, integration into foreign systems without losing identity, strategic foresight, family cohesion, and the intertwining of human agency with divine purpose. This period bridges the ancestral narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the later collective experiences of the Israelite people, ultimately setting the stage for the defining event of their history, the Exodus. Through Joseph, we see the emergence of Israel as a people who could survive and adapt in complex political and social environments. His story is both a tale of individual brilliance and a communal lesson in resilience. Egypt, far from being a passive backdrop, functions as a crucible in which Israel's early identity is forged, a land that tests faith, sharpens strategy, and ensures that when the Israelites eventually leave, they do so as a united, structured, and purposeful community ready to claim their future in Canaan. The Exodus is arguably the defining moment in the history of Israel, a story of liberation, leadership, and transformation that marks the transition of the Israelites from a family of migrants in Egypt into a nation with purpose, law, and identity. This narrative, immortalized in Scripture, resonates far beyond the desert sands, shaping religious thought, culture, and the understanding of freedom across millennia. But beneath the mythic and religious layers lies a historical and social reality, a people emerging from oppression, forging unity, and confronting the immense challenges of survival. The story begins in Egypt, where the Israelites, who had settled in Goshen during Joseph's time, had multiplied into a substantial population. The land of the Nile, once a refuge and opportunity, gradually became a place of enslavement. According to tradition, a new pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, a ruler concerned not with past alliances, but with security and control. Fearing the growing number and strength of the Israelites, he subjected them to forced labor, building cities and monumental works, and imposed harsh rules intended to suppress their identity and potential. The narrative emphasizes that oppression was both systemic and existential. The Israelites were deprived of autonomy, subjected to hard labor in brickmaking and construction, and threatened with infanticide as Pharaoh ordered the killing of Hebrew male newborns. Such conditions created a crucible for collective identity. Under duress, they developed resilience, solidarity, and a consciousness that they were distinct, not just a group of laborers, but a people bound by lineage, history, and emerging faith. Into this crucible comes Moses, one of history's most iconic leaders. According to tradition, he was born during a time of danger, placed in a basket on the Nile to escape Pharaoh's decree, and discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. Raised in the Egyptian royal household, Moses would have been educated in administration, culture, and leadership, learning the systems of the empire while remaining rooted in his Hebrew heritage. His unique position gave him insight into both the oppressor's mechanisms of power and the needs of the people he was destined to lead. Moses' calling is central to the Exodus narrative. On Mount Horeb, in the wilderness, he encounters the divine in the form of the burning bush, a miraculous vision in which God commands him to confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom. The encounter symbolizes the fusion of human agency with divine authority, emphasizing that liberation required courage, negotiation, and strategy. Moses is reluctant, aware of his limitations and fearful of Pharaoh's power, but the narrative portrays a gradual embrace of responsibility, transforming him from a hesitant figure into a decisive leader. Pharaoh's initial resistance sets the stage for a series of confrontations, famously represented in the 10 plagues. These calamities, from the Nile turning to blood to devastating locust swarms, are depicted not only as supernatural events, but also as systematic challenges to Egyptian power and religion. Each plague undermined the authority of Egyptian gods, disrupted society, and demonstrated that the Israelites' God was a force capable of altering nature and history. Historically, some scholars suggest that these stories may reflect real events, environmental disasters, Nile floods, or social upheavals, remembered and dramatized through oral tradition, whether literal or symbolic. The plagues serve as narrative devices that convey both divine authority and human struggle against entrenched oppression. The climax of the Exodus is the Passover and the departure from Egypt. After the final plague, the death of the Egyptian firstborn, Pharaoh relents, allowing the Israelites to leave. They depart rapidly, carrying with them not only material possessions, but also their emerging identity, memories of oppression and collective purpose. This departure marks the birth of Israel as a nation, a people defined by shared experience, covenantal relationship with God, and a vision of destiny in a promised land. However, freedom is not immediate. The Israelites face the daunting task of crossing the Red Sea, a miraculous event described as a moment of divine intervention where waters part to allow safe passage and then return to destroy pursuing Egyptian forces. Symbolically, the crossing represents transformation, the transition from slavery to nationhood, from fear to faith, from dependence to responsibility. In historical terms, it may reflect the movement of people across natural barriers, migration patterns, in response to environmental pressures, or the memory of battles and escapes dramatized into epic narrative. Once in the wilderness, the Israelites confront the harsh realities of life without the infrastructure of Egypt. The desert is a place of scarcity, exposure, and constant challenge, yet it is also a formative environment where the Israelites develop social cohesion, legal structures, and spiritual identity. The narrative emphasizes divine provision, manna from heaven, quail, and water from rocks, reinforcing dependence on faith while teaching the community lessons about obedience, patience, and resilience. It is during this wilderness period that Moses receives the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, a foundational moment in both religious and civil history. These laws codify morality, justice, and social responsibility, extending beyond ritual to include ethical behavior, governance, and community cohesion. The commandments provide a framework that unites diverse tribal groups into a single legal and spiritual entity. From an anthropological perspective, this period reflects the development of codified law as a tool for social cohesion, particularly in nomadic or semi-nomadic societies facing existential threats. The wilderness years, often described as 40 years, serve multiple functions. They are a time of purification, education, and preparation. Generations are tested, leadership structures are formalized, and the people's identity as Israel, a covenantal nation, solidifies. Historical parallels can be drawn to other migratory peoples who endured prolonged periods in challenging environments, emerging with stronger group cohesion and cultural identity. The Exodus also establishes enduring themes of liberation, justice, and divine human partnership. Moses embodies leadership that balances authority with humility, strategy with faith, and negotiation with moral conviction. The journey from Egypt is not simply physical, but psychological and spiritual. The Israelites learn to navigate uncertainty, trust in leadership, and embrace a vision that transcends immediate survival. Finally, the Exodus connects past, present, and future. It links Abraham's covenant to a tangible historical moment, the promise of land, the continuity of lineage, and the fulfillment of divine guidance converge in the liberation from Egypt. This event resonates across centuries, shaping Israelite consciousness, informing ritual practice, such as Passover, and providing a model of collective resilience that has inspired countless generations. In sum, the Exodus is not merely a story of escape, but a complex historical and cultural transformation. It is where Israel moves from a collection of tribes and families into a nation bound by law, faith, and shared experience. The journey from Egypt through the desert lays the foundations for everything that follows: settlement in Canaan, establishment of monarchy, and development of religious and national identity. Moses, as the central figure, symbolizes both the human capacity for leadership and the enduring power of faith to shape destiny. Through the Exodus, we see Israel emerge as more than a people. It becomes a concept, a vision of liberation, identity, and covenant that will echo through history, literature, and religion for millennia. The events of this period are not just foundational stories, but enduring lessons in leadership, resilience, and the transformation of communities under pressure. The Israelites' passage through Egypt and the wilderness represents the beginning of their journey as a nation, a people united, tested, and prepared for the challenges of the land that awaits them. The Exodus marked the Israelites' dramatic escape from Egypt, but freedom came with immediate and daunting challenges. The wilderness years, a period traditionally described as 40 years, were more than just a journey from Egypt to Canaan. They were a transformative era that shaped the Israelite identity, social structure, religious practices, and political cohesion. These years were harsh, formative, and foundational, turning a disparate group of families into a nation capable of entering and conquering the land of their ancestors' promise. The wilderness itself was a formidable teacher. Stretching across the Sinai Peninsula, this landscape was a mix of deserts, rocky highlands, and arid valleys. Water was scarce, food was limited, and temperatures swung dramatically between searing days and freezing nights. The Israelites, used to the fertile plains of Goshen, faced a dramatic environmental shift. Survival required organization, adaptation, and discipline, qualities that would define the people in the centuries to come. The desert was more than physical, it was symbolic of the trials necessary to forge a collective identity and spiritual resilience. One of the earliest and most recurring themes in the wilderness narratives is the Israelites' dependence on divine provision. According to Scripture, when food became scarce, manna descended from heaven, a miraculous, bread-like substance appearing each morning. Birds, specifically quail, provided additional sustenance. Water emerged from unexpected sources, such as rocks, under Moses' guidance. While these accounts are often understood in religious terms, they also reflect the challenges of sustaining a population in a desert environment. Anthropologists and historians note that nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples in arid regions developed similar adaptive strategies, relying on seasonal food sources, livestock, and careful management of scarce water. The wilderness years also served as a period of population organization and social structuring. The Israelites were divided into 12 tribes, descended from the sons of Jacob. Each tribe was assigned specific roles and responsibilities, contributing to collective survival. Leadership was centralized in Moses, with Aaron and the Levites providing religious and ritual guidance. This combination of civil and spiritual governance was crucial. Unlike a monarchy or empire, the Israelite leadership relied on consensus, law, and divine authority. The wilderness tested this system continuously as disputes, rebellions, and logistical challenges demanded both decisiveness and diplomacy. Rebellion and dissent were constant themes. The narratives recount incidents such as the golden calf, where the people, impatient with Moses' absence on Mount Sinai, fashioned an idol from gold. This event, while dramatic, highlights real social dynamics the tension between long-standing cultural practices and emerging religious identity. The Israelites were forging a new system of belief, moving from polytheistic Canaanite traditions toward monotheism, and the wilderness acted as both classroom and proving ground. Leadership failures, crises of faith, and moral tests were woven into the collective experience, ensuring that the community's values, laws, and cohesion were continuously reinforced. The laws and commandments received during this period are arguably the most enduring legacy of the wilderness years. The Ten Commandments, given on Mount Sinai, codified moral and social principles that structured family life, civic interaction, and spiritual practice. Beyond the commandments, additional legal and ritual codes were developed, covering civil disputes, religious observances, dietary restrictions, and purity regulations. These laws created a framework that transformed a migratory group into a self-conscious society capable of governance, cooperation, and ethical behavior. The desert became the proving ground for law, a crucible where obedience, justice, and communal responsibility were tested daily. Travel through the wilderness was not uniform. The Israelites moved in encampments, organized around tribal groups with defined territories. The Levites, as a priestly class, oversaw religious practice, while each tribe managed its own logistics. The tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, traveled with them, serving as the spiritual and administrative center. Its presence symbolized God's ongoing guidance and provided a focal point for community cohesion. Archaeologically, evidence for portable sanctuaries and semi-nomadic encampments in the Levant during this period supports the plausibility of such arrangements, even if the exact biblical descriptions are theological in nature. Challenges in the wilderness also fostered identity and cultural memory. The people remembered the oppression in Egypt, the miraculous deliverance, and the trials along the way. Stories, songs, and rituals were passed orally, creating a shared historical consciousness. The wilderness years, though physically harsh, were intellectually and spiritually rich. They provided the time and space for the Israelites to consolidate memories, codify traditions, and instill a sense of destiny in each generation. By the time they approached the edge of Canaan, a unified identity, religious, social, and cultural, had emerged. Interestingly, the 40-year period also served as a mechanism for generational renewal. According to tradition, the generation that left Egypt was largely not permitted to enter Canaan due to disobedience, impatience, and lack of faith. This enforced temporal span allowed a new generation, raised entirely in the desert under the covenant, to inherit the land. Anthropologically, this makes sense. Environmental adaptation, intergenerational socialization, and cultural cohesion are often strengthened when a population undergoes prolonged formative experiences. The desert forged not only spiritual resilience, but also practical survival skills, preparing the Israelites for the conquest and settlement of a complex, contested landscape. The wilderness years were punctuated by key events of leadership and diplomacy. Moses regularly mediated disputes, organized military responses to nomadic attacks, and negotiated with tribal leaders. His leadership style combined legal authority, religious guidance, and moral persuasion. Aaron and the Levites provided ritual legitimacy, while elders and tribal heads implemented practical administration. This multi-layered governance system allowed the Israelites to survive in a volatile environment, maintain cohesion, and prepare for life as a settled people in Canaan. Religious identity was reinforced constantly. Rituals, such as daily offerings, Sabbath observance, and festivals like Passover, created a rhythm and structure to desert life. They also encoded the history of oppression, deliverance, and covenantal relationship into everyday practice. These rituals were not merely symbolic, they were tools for maintaining unity, fostering obedience, and embedding collective memory. After the conquest of Canaan, the Israelites faced a new challenge: governing themselves and maintaining unity across the 12 tribes in a land filled with competing peoples and complex social dynamics. This era, known as the period of the Judges, spans roughly 200 to 300 years before the establishment of monarchy. It was a time of decentralized leadership, recurring cycles of crisis, and the development of the social, religious, and military frameworks that would define Israelite society. Unlike the centralized governance of a monarchy, Israel during this period relied on tribal organization and temporary leaders called judges. These were not judges in the modern legal sense. Rather, they were charismatic leaders, often chosen for their military skill, moral authority, or spiritual insight. The judges rose in times of crisis to deliver the people from foreign oppression, enforce laws, or restore order. Their authority was situational and personal, relying on reputation and divine sanction rather than hereditary or institutional power. The historical and archaeological context of this period shows that the central highlands of Canaan were a patchwork of settlements, small villages, fortified hilltops, and agricultural terraces, often isolated from one another. Each tribe occupied its own territory, with some degree of autonomy. Communication and coordination across regions were difficult, so leadership needed to be adaptive, situational, and deeply tied to local social structures. This decentralized model both reflected and reinforced Israel's tribal identity, which valued kinship and communal responsibility. One of the recurring themes of the Judges is the cycle of apostasy and deliverance. According to Scripture, the people of Israel would fall into idolatry or disobedience, inviting oppression by neighboring peoples such as the Philistines, Moabites, Midianites, or Canaanite city-states. In response, God would raise up a judge to deliver them. This cyclical pattern served multiple purposes. It reinforced faith in divine guidance, illustrated the consequences of social and moral failings, and highlighted the necessity of leadership and unity. Deborah is one of the most notable judges, celebrated not only for her leadership, but also for her role as a prophetess. She coordinated military campaigns, inspired tribal alliances, and provided legal and spiritual guidance. Her story exemplifies the combination of civic, military, and religious authority that characterized the period. Similarly, Gideon and Jephthah led their tribes to victories against powerful enemies, often with limited resources, relying on strategy, morale, and faith. These leaders demonstrated that leadership in this era was as much about ingenuity and courage as it was about divine mandate. Military strategy during the Judges period was shaped by geography, resource constraints, and tribal autonomy. The Israelites relied on small mobile forces capable of surprise attacks and raids rather than large, centralized armies. Knowledge of the terrain, hills, valleys, and rivers provided tactical advantages. The stories of battles against Midianites, Philistines, and other enemies highlight guerrilla-style warfare, intelligence gathering, and the ability to unify multiple tribes temporarily for collective action. These military practices laid the groundwork for later strategies employed during the monarchy. Socially, the period of the judges was formative. Tribal elders, families, and religious leaders played critical roles in governance, dispute resolution, and enforcement of laws. The decentralized system meant that accountability often rested on local consensus, negotiation, and communal pressure. While this created resilience and flexibility, it also left Israel vulnerable to internal divisions and external threats. The narratives of recurring oppression emphasize the challenges of maintaining unity without strong, centralized authority. Religious identity during this period evolved in tandem with social and political structures. Israelite religion became more codified, emphasizing monotheism, ritual observance, and moral conduct. Sacred sites, altars, and shrines were established across tribal territories. Prophetic voices, often associated with the judges themselves, reminded the people of the covenant with God and the consequences of disobedience. The period reinforced the link between ethical behavior, communal responsibility, and divine favor, shaping the cultural and spiritual identity of Israel. Women played significant roles during this era, particularly in leadership and prophecy. Deborah's position as both judge and military strategist is unparalleled, but other women, though less documented, influenced tribal politics, family alliances, and religious practices. Their contributions demonstrate the complex social dynamics of early Israel, where leadership could be situational and merit-based, not solely hereditary or gender-restricted. Economically, the period of the judges was one of subsistence and localized trade. Agriculture, livestock herding, and control of natural resources shaped settlement patterns. Tribes often competed for fertile land and access to water sources, creating both internal tensions and opportunities for collaboration. The seasonal rhythms of planting, harvesting, and pastoral movement dictated social organization and influenced military campaigns, as armies had to balance defense with the protection of crops and herds. The stories of the judges also emphasize moral and ethical dilemmas. Leaders like Samson demonstrated extraordinary personal strength, but also vulnerability to temptation and misjudgment. These narratives illustrate the consequences of individual choices for the broader community, reinforcing social norms, expectations of leadership, and the moral framework tied to covenantal obedience. The recurring tension between personal ambition and communal responsibility defined both the successes and failures of this period. Despite its challenges, the Judges era was a period of cultural and territorial consolidation. The Israelites established semi-permanent settlements, fortified strategic locations, and developed legal and religious frameworks that would later support centralized monarchy. The interplay between tribal autonomy and collective identity ensured that Israel could survive internal disputes while maintaining cohesion. Over time, these experiences created a shared memory of resilience, divine guidance, and the necessity of strong leadership. By the end of the period, the limitations of decentralized governance became clear. External threats persisted, Internal divisions occasionally escalated into conflict, and a desire for centralized authority grew. These pressures paved the way for the transition to monarchy, beginning with Saul and later solidifying under David and Solomon. Yet the lessons of the judges, leadership, adaptability, faith, and tribal cooperation continued to inform Israelite society, culture, and governance. In summary, the period of the Judges represents a formative era in Israel's history. It was characterized by cyclical challenges, charismatic leadership, tribal governance, and the evolution of religious and cultural identity. This period tested the Israelites' resilience, taught lessons in cooperation and strategic thinking, and established the social and religious foundations for a centralized kingdom. Through military campaigns, moral instruction, and spiritual guidance, the judges prepared Israel for the next stage, uniting as a nation under kingship, controlling territory, and consolidating the promise that began with Abraham centuries earlier. Following the decentralized, tumultuous period of the judges, the Israelites faced a new challenge: the need for centralized authority. The tribes, while cohesive in faith and identity, were vulnerable to external threats and internal disunity. This period of instability paved the way for the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, beginning with Saul, continuing with David, and reaching its zenith under Solomon. The rise of the monarchy represents a turning point in Israel's history, a transformation from tribal confederation to a unified territorial state with political, military, and religious institutions. The first king of Israel, Saul, emerged in response to the growing demand for centralized leadership. According to biblical accounts, the Israelites sought a king like the nations around them, reflecting both practical and cultural pressures. The Philistines, among other neighboring powers, posed a constant threat, and Saul's kingship offered the promise of organized military defense and national cohesion. Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, was chosen for his physical stature, leadership potential, and tribal legitimacy. His reign demonstrates the challenges of uniting a fragmented society and balancing individual ambition with communal responsibility. By the time the Israelites approached the borders of Canaan, the wilderness had done its work. A group once defined primarily by kinship and survival had become a nation defined by law, faith, and shared destiny. The desert years were a crucible. They forged leadership, codified law, shaped cultural identity, and tested faith in extreme conditions. Every hardship, rebellion, and divine intervention contributed to a population ready to claim its inheritance, a people shaped as much by adversity as by promise. In essence, the wilderness years are a masterclass in nation building under pressure. They highlight the interplay of environment, leadership, religion, and culture in shaping a people capable of survival, adaptation, and ultimately conquest. The Israelites emerged from the desert not merely as survivors, but as a cohesive, disciplined, and spiritually grounded nation, ready to enter Canaan and fulfill the covenant that had begun with Abraham centuries earlier. After decades of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites finally approached the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Canaan. The conquest of this land marks one of the most dramatic chapters in Israel's history, transforming a nomadic, covenant-bound people into a territorial nation. It is a story of strategy, survival, faith, and the integration of diverse peoples and cultures into a singular emerging identity. Canaan was no empty wilderness. It was a region of well-established city-states, each fortified and thriving. Cities like Jericho, Hazor, Megiddo, and Ai were centers of trade, agriculture, and political power. These city-states had complex social structures, kings, armies, and alliances, and they were often interconnected with Egypt and Mesopotamia through trade and diplomacy. The Israelites entering Canaan would not encounter passive lands, but a dynamic, contested environment where control depended on military skill, leadership, and strategy. The biblical narrative emphasizes that the conquest was divinely guided, with God providing instructions and support. Joshua, Moses' successor, emerges as the central military and spiritual leader, tasked with organizing the tribes, leading campaigns, and distributing land among the people. Leadership under Joshua illustrates a combination of religious authority and practical military strategy, an approach necessary to coordinate the 12 tribes in a hostile landscape. One of the most iconic episodes is the Battle of Jericho, where the Israelites, following God's instructions, circled the city walls for 7 days before the walls miraculously collapsed. While the story carries miraculous elements, historians suggest that such accounts may reflect either symbolic memory or the historical destruction of Jericho by invading groups during the Late Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence shows that Jericho was indeed fortified and suffered destruction, though dating and attribution remain debated. Regardless of the exact historical details, the story conveys strategic patience, psychological warfare, and the Israelites' belief in divine support, elements that shaped their approach to subsequent campaigns. The conquest was not uniform or instantaneous. Some regions, particularly in the Central Highlands, were settled with relatively little resistance. Other areas, such as the northern plains and coastal cities, involved prolonged campaigns and complex negotiations. The Israelites had to adapt to varying terrains, climates, and enemy tactics. Military organization was tribal, with each group contributing forces and expertise. Leadership was decentralized yet coordinated, reflecting a balance between unity under Joshua and autonomy within each tribe. This structure allowed flexibility, essential for a population transitioning from nomadic life to settled warfare and governance. Religion played a central role in the conquest. Success and failure were interpreted as signs of divine favor or disfavor. Rituals, offerings, and obedience to God's commands were integral to strategy. This intertwining of military and spiritual authority reinforced cohesion among the tribes and provided moral justification for campaigns. From a sociological perspective, religion served not only as motivation, but also as a mechanism for social control, maintaining unity and obedience during uncertain and violent times. The conquest also involved integration and displacement of existing populations. Some cities were destroyed, while others were incorporated through treaties or alliances. The Israelites absorbed agricultural knowledge, local customs, and economic practices from Canaanite populations. While later texts emphasize complete destruction in some cases, archaeological evidence suggests a combination of assimilation, displacement, and selective occupation. This nuanced process allowed the Israelites to establish themselves while maintaining distinct cultural and religious practices. The allocation of land among the 12 tribes was a critical administrative step, ensuring equitable distribution and minimizing internal conflict. Each tribe received territories that suited their strengths. The Levites, as priests, did not receive extensive land, but were supported through tithes. Judah and Ephraim received fertile regions suitable for agriculture and settlement. This distribution reflects strategic planning, combining resource management with social cohesion. Land, in this context, was not just a commodity, but a tangible fulfillment of the covenant, a connection between divine promise and human stewardship. Economically, the conquest allowed the Israelites to transition from nomadic pastoralism to a mixed economy of agriculture, herding, and trade. Fertile valleys provided grain, vineyards, and olive orchards. Hills supported sheep and goat herding. The capture of cities enabled control over trade routes and access to external goods, integrating Israel into the broader regional economy. These developments laid the groundwork for political centralization and the eventual rise of monarchy. The conquest also established the boundaries of Israelite identity. Interaction with Canaanite populations forced decisions about intermarriage, religious practices, and social norms. Certain tribes and communities, such as the Levites, became custodians of religious law, while others focused on agriculture or defense. The process of settlement solidified Israelite culture, combining inherited traditions from the wilderness with new practices adapted from Canaanite society. The narrative of conquest emphasizes both collective effort and individual heroism. Leaders like Joshua, Caleb, and tribal heads are celebrated for bravery, faith, and strategic insight. Their stories illustrate how leadership, courage, and loyalty to a shared vision can overcome formidable obstacles. At the same time, the conquest required cooperation, discipline, and resilience from the entire community. This balance between leadership and communal responsibility became a defining feature of Israelite governance and identity. It is important to note that the conquest was gradual and complex. While biblical texts often present it as a swift and divinely sanctioned campaign, archaeological evidence suggests a more protracted process, including periods of coexistence with existing populations, cultural assimilation, and local resistance. Understanding this complexity provides insight into the challenges of establishing a nation in a contested and culturally diverse landscape. By the end of the conquest, Israel was transformed. The tribes were settled, the land was under their control, and the covenantal promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob seemed tangible. The wilderness years had forged unity, and the conquest had provided territory, economic resources, and strategic security. Israel had transitioned from a migratory, covenant-bound people into a land-based, politically organized society capable of self-governance and military defense. Culturally, the conquest left lasting legacies, rituals commemorating battles, festivals celebrating divine guidance, and laws codifying governance and social behavior reinforced identity. Cities became centers of administration, worship, and trade, blending inherited practices with new innovations. The integration of conquered peoples and local knowledge enriched Israelite culture, while maintaining distinctive religious and legal frameworks. In summary, the conquest of Canaan represents a pivotal moment in Israel's history. It combined military strategy, religious faith, social organization, and cultural integration to transform a previously nomadic, covenant-bound community into a territorially defined nation. The land itself became central to identity, economy, and spirituality, fulfilling promises that began with Abraham centuries earlier. The conquest laid the foundation for the next phase of Israelite history, the period of the judges, in which governance, justice, and leadership would continue to evolve in the context of both internal challenges and external threats. Saul's rule, however, was marked by tension between divine authority and human governance. He achieved initial military successes, consolidating power and defending Israelite territories against the Philistines. Yet his reign was fraught with political missteps, personal insecurities, and failure to fully adhere to divine directives. The biblical narrative emphasizes Saul's shortcomings not merely as personal failings, but as lessons in leadership and the consequences of deviating from covenantal obedience. Historically, Saul's reign reflects the difficulties of transitioning from tribal confederation to centralized statehood, where balancing tribal autonomy and national unity was inherently challenging. The rise of David, Saul's eventual successor, represents the consolidation of monarchy and the emergence of Israel as a regional power. David, from the tribe of Judah, is renowned for both his military genius and his unifying vision. His early exploits, most famously his victory over Goliath, established him as a figure of courage, strategic thinking, and divine favor. Beyond personal heroism, David's significance lies in his ability to unify the 12 tribes, integrating previously rival factions under a single monarchy. This unification laid the foundation for a politically and culturally cohesive Israel. David's reign also highlights the centrality of Jerusalem as both a political and religious capital. Upon ascending to the throne, David captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, establishing it as the administrative heart of the kingdom. This choice was strategic. Jerusalem was geographically central, defensible, and not previously claimed by any single tribe, making it an ideal location for unifying the nation. Beyond politics, David's establishment of Jerusalem as a religious center reinforced his role as both king and custodian of Israel's covenant with God, blending governance with spiritual authority. Military expansion under David was critical to Israel's emergence as a regional power. He conducted campaigns against the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites, securing borders and controlling trade routes. These campaigns were not mere conquests. They were strategic efforts to protect economic interests, consolidate political control, and ensure the security of Israelite settlements. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Levant was a highly competitive and militarized environment, making David's unification and expansion a remarkable achievement in terms of leadership, diplomacy, and organization. David's reign also illustrates the intertwining of law, religion, and governance. As king, he codified aspects of Israelite law, promoted religious observance, and strengthened institutions that had emerged during the wilderness and Judges periods. The integration of civil authority and religious leadership reinforced national cohesion and legitimacy. Additionally, David's personal legacy, including the authorship of Psalms, patronage of priests, and establishment of a centralized religious structure, left enduring cultural and spiritual foundations for Israel. The monarchy reached its zenith under Solomon, David's son, whose reign is often remembered for wisdom, diplomacy, and monumental building projects. Solomon expanded Israel's influence through strategic marriages, alliances, and trade agreements, integrating Israel more fully into the regional economy. Cities like Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer were fortified, providing both defense and control over key trade routes. Solomon's rule represents a period of relative peace, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing, allowing the Israelite kingdom to consolidate internally while projecting influence externally. One of Solomon's most enduring legacies was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This monumental project centralized religious worship, provided a permanent sanctuary for the Ark of the Covenant, and reinforced Jerusalem's status as both political and spiritual capital. The temple was a powerful symbol of divine presence, national identity, and state authority. It also formalized priestly roles and ritual practices, codifying religious observance in a permanent architectural and institutional framework. Economically, Solomon's reign was transformative. Trade networks extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean, facilitating the import of luxury goods, timber, and precious metals. Agricultural productivity increased through terracing, irrigation, and regional control. Israel's prosperity under Solomon allowed for cultural achievements, including literary, artistic, and architectural advancements. These developments not only elevated Israel's status among neighboring nations, but also reinforced the legitimacy of the monarchy as both a political and spiritual institution. However, the rise of monarchy was not without challenges. Centralized authority sometimes conflicted with tribal autonomy, creating tensions between the king and regional leaders. Heavy taxation and forced labor for monumental projects, particularly under Solomon, generated social and economic strains. These challenges would later contribute to the division of the kingdom after Solomon's death, illustrating the delicate balance required to maintain unity across diverse tribes and territories. Religiously, the monarchy reinforced the covenantal relationship with God while also testing the Israelites' fidelity. The kings were expected to uphold moral and religious standards, act justly, and serve as intermediaries between God and the people. Deviations, favoritism, or idolatry were seen as threats to both national cohesion and divine favor. The integration of political and religious authority under the monarchy created a powerful framework for governance, but also introduced vulnerabilities, as the personal failings of leaders could affect the entire nation. In summary, the rise of the monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon marks a pivotal period in Israel's history. Saul's reign illustrates the challenges of transitioning from tribal governance to centralized leadership. David exemplifies the unification and militarization of Israel as a regional power, and Solomon represents the height of political, economic, and cultural achievement. Together, These monarchs transformed Israel from a loosely organized tribal confederation into a territorially defined, politically cohesive, and spiritually anchored nation. The monarchy established patterns of governance, law, and religious integration that would influence Israel's subsequent history. It centralized political power, secured territorial borders, and created enduring cultural and spiritual institutions. Yet it also exposed the complexities of leadership, the tensions between tribal autonomy and central authority, and the delicate balance of economic, military, and spiritual stewardship. This era laid the foundation for Israel's identity as a kingdom, a people bound by covenant, and a nation whose influence would extend far beyond its immediate geographic and temporal boundaries. The death of Solomon marked a turning point in Israelite history. While his reign epitomized unity, prosperity, and centralized power, it also left unresolved tensions between the tribes, burdensome taxation, and regional inequalities. These pressures culminated in a political schism, dividing the kingdom into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The period of the divided kingdom, spanning roughly from 930 BCE to 72 BCE for Israel, and continuing in Judah until 586 BCE, is a complex era of political maneuvering, religious evolution, social challenges, and external pressures. The split occurred when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, ascended the throne. The northern tribes, frustrated by heavy taxation and forced labor imposed under Solomon, sought relief. Rehoboam's response, refusing to lighten the burden and relying on advice from younger advisors rather than experienced elders, triggered a rebellion. 10 northern tribes broke away, forming the Kingdom of Israel, while the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, creating the Kingdom of Judah. This division was not merely political, it reflected long-standing tribal tensions, economic disparities, and competing visions of governance. Geographically, the two kingdoms occupied distinct landscapes. Israel, in the northern regions, controlled fertile plains, trade routes to the Mediterranean, and strategic highlands. This positioning allowed Israel economic vitality and exposure to regional powers like Aram Damascus, Phoenicia, and Assyria. Judah, in the south, was smaller and centered around Jerusalem, with less arable land but defensible terrain. These geographic realities influenced military strategy, economic capacity, and political stability. Israel's abundance invited both prosperity and vulnerability to foreign invasion, while Judah's defensibility allowed longer survival despite limited resources. Politically, both kingdoms faced continuous internal and external challenges. Israel, with multiple tribal centers and a newly established monarchy under Jeroboam, struggled to consolidate power and maintain loyalty across its northern territories. Jeroboam established alternative worship sites at Bethel and Dan, centralizing religious practice outside Jerusalem to prevent reunification under Judah's control. This move had profound social and religious consequences, as it codified divisions in the worship and practice, setting a precedent for competing religious traditions. Judah, by contrast, retained Jerusalem as a political and spiritual center. Its monarchy was more stable initially, with dynastic continuity and centralized authority under the Davidic line. Yet Judah faced constant threats from Israel, Philistines, Edomites, and later Assyria. Maintaining political stability required a delicate balance of diplomacy, military preparedness, and religious legitimacy. The southern kingdom's reliance on Jerusalem as a unifying spiritual hub reinforced its cultural cohesion even in times of political pressure. Religion during the divided kingdom was deeply intertwined with politics. In Israel, competing worship practices created internal tension and debates about fidelity to the covenant. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha emerged as central figures, challenging idolatry, advocating social justice, and warning of impending divine judgment. Their presence underscores the moral and spiritual crises that accompanied political division. In Judah, prophets such as Isaiah and Micah offered guidance and warnings, emphasizing ethical conduct, faithfulness, and trust in God over reliance on political or military alliances. Prophetic activity during this period reflects the inseparability of religion, governance, and social morality in Israelite society. Economically, the northern and southern kingdoms followed distinct paths. Israel's fertile plains and trade networks allowed for greater wealth accumulation, agricultural production, and urban development. This economic advantage, however, attracted foreign powers like Assyria, making Israel vulnerable to conquest. Judah's limited resources necessitated careful management, reliance on Jerusalem as a central hub, and occasional strategic submission or tribute to stronger neighbors. Economic conditions shaped social structures, migration patterns, and political alliances, reinforcing the differences between the two kingdoms. Military strategy was similarly influenced by geography and external threats. Israel's exposed northern border required frequent engagement with Aram Damascus, Moabites, and other neighboring states. The kingdom maintained standing armies and fortified cities to protect trade routes and settlements. Judah, with its defensible terrain, relied more on fortifications and localized military campaigns. Both kingdoms faced repeated invasions, demonstrating the precarious balance of power in the Levant during the first millennium BCE. The division also had profound social and cultural effects. Tribal identities became both sources of unity and tension. Israel's population was diverse, with integration of previously conquered Canaanite peoples, leading to syncretic religious practices and social stratification. Judah maintained a more homogeneous identity, centered on Jerusalem and Davidic legitimacy, but also faced internal challenges, including class divisions, prophetic criticism, and occasional rebellion. These dynamics illustrate the complexity of nation building in a divided society where cohesion and identity must be constantly negotiated. The fall of Israel in 720 BCE to Assyria marked a dramatic turning point. The northern kingdom's elite and many citizens were exiled, a historical event remembered as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Assyrian conquest reshaped the political landscape, redistributed populations, and influenced cultural memory. While Israel ceased to exist as an independent state, its legacy continued through Judah, prophetic literature, and the memories preserved in the tribal traditions. Judah survived for more than a century after Israel's fall, maintaining its Davidic monarchy and religious institutions. However, pressures from Babylon, internal corruption, and social inequities eventually led to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the destruction of the First Temple, exile of the elite, and subjugation under Babylon marked the beginning of a new chapter, the Babylonian exile, which would deeply influence Jewish identity, law, and religious thought. In summary, the divided kingdom was a period of profound transformation characterized by political fragmentation, social complexity, religious evolution, and external threats. Israel and Judah developed distinct political, economic, and cultural identities while sharing a common ancestry and covenantal heritage. Prophetic voices emerged to guide, warn, and inspire, emphasizing the moral and spiritual responsibilities of both rulers and citizens. Despite divisions, the period laid critical foundations for later reunification, religious codification, and national consciousness. The divided kingdom illustrates how political schisms, geographic realities, economic conditions, and religious guidance can shape the destiny of a people. It is a testament to the resilience of Israelite identity, the challenges of governance in a diverse and contested land, and the enduring influence of faith, law, and prophecy in shaping historical memory. This era, with all its triumphs and failures, bridges the unified monarchy and the exile, connecting the promise of the ancestors with the trials and survival strategies that define Israel's long-term history. The Babylonian exile represents one of the most transformative periods in the history of Israel. After centuries of tribal cohesion, conquest, kingdom building, and religious evolution, the southern kingdom of Judah faced a catastrophic collapse. In 586 BCE, Babylonian forces under King Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem, razed the first temple, and deported a significant portion of the population to Babylon. This traumatic event reshaped Israelite identity, faith, culture, and historical consciousness, leaving an enduring imprint on Jewish history and theology. The immediate cause of the exile was multifaceted. Judah had experienced recurring political instability, economic strain, and weak kingship following Solomon. Despite prophetic warnings from figures like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Habakkuk, the monarchy persisted in alliances, idolatry, and resistance to foreign domination. Babylon, rising as a dominant regional power after supplanting Assyria, demanded loyalty and tribute. Judah's rebellion against Babylonian hegemony prompted a military response that culminated in the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, the heart of Israelite religion, politics, and culture. The siege itself was devastating. Babylonian forces systematically breached the city's defenses, leading to widespread starvation, destruction, and loss of life. Historical and archaeological evidence supports the scale of this catastrophe, with layers of destruction at Jerusalem and other sites in Judah corresponding to this period. Temples, palaces, and administrative centers were burned, while the elite, including priests, scribes, and nobility, were deported to Babylon. These actions aimed not merely to punish, but to neutralize potential resistance and integrate Judah into the Babylonian Empire. Life in Babylon posed significant challenges to the exiled population. They were displaced from their land, uprooted from agricultural livelihoods, and forced to live under foreign authority. Yet, paradoxically, the exile also fostered resilience, adaptation, and cultural consolidation. Communities of exiles maintained religious practices, observed the Sabbath, and transmitted sacred texts orally. Temples and altars were absent, But the focus shifted toward synagogues, prayer, and the study of Torah, laying the groundwork for later religious development. Prophetic voices played a crucial role during this period. Jeremiah, who remained in Judah during the initial stages of the exile, emphasized obedience, covenant fidelity, and hope for eventual restoration. He interpreted the destruction as both punishment and divine teaching, framing the exile as an opportunity for reflection, moral reform, and spiritual growth. Ezekiel, exiled in Babylon, offered visions of renewal, including the iconic prophecy of dry bones and the restoration of Israel. These messages provided meaning amid catastrophe, reinforcing identity and encouraging survival through faith, law, and communal solidarity. The exile also catalyzed literary and theological innovation. During this period, portions of the Hebrew Bible were compiled, edited, and codified. Texts such as historical narratives, psalms, prophetic writings, and legal codes were organized in ways that preserved collective memory and transmitted cultural values. The focus shifted from temple-centered worship to law, ethics, and study, emphasizing a portable and adaptable religious identity that could survive displacement. This literary activity ensured that Israelite culture remained cohesive despite geographic separation and political subjugation. Economically and socially, the exiles had to adapt to urban life in Babylon, a cosmopolitan and diverse empire. Many exiles found employment as administrators, artisans, and scribes, integrating into Babylonian society while maintaining distinct identity markers such as dietary laws and religious observance. The experience of exile emphasized flexibility, resilience, and the capacity to sustain culture in foreign settings, traits that would become defining features of the Jewish diaspora in subsequent centuries. Politically, the exile underscored the vulnerability of small states in a region dominated by great empires. Judah's prior alliances and rebellions against Assyria and Babylon illustrate the precarious balance required for survival. Babylonian conquest, while catastrophic, also imposed a form of governance that indirectly preserved Israelite society by concentrating exiles in a central location, limiting guerrilla resistance, and creating conditions for cultural consolidation rather than total annihilation. The exile profoundly influenced religious thought. Concepts such as ethical monotheism, covenant, justice, and repentance were reinforced. Worship adapted to new circumstances, focusing on prayer, study, and ritual observance rather than temple sacrifice alone. The experience emphasized that Israelite identity was not bound solely to territory or temple, but could persist in memory, law, and communal practice. Theologically, the exile shaped the expectation of eventual redemption, the messianic hope, and the importance of divine guidance in national survival. Upon the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, the exiles received permission from King Cyrus the Great to return to Judah and rebuild the temple, inaugurating the period known as the Second Temple Era. This repatriation was selective and partial. Many exiles remained in Babylon, forming permanent diaspora communities. The return to Judah marked both continuity and transformation. The land was reclaimed, the temple rebuilt, but political sovereignty remained limited under Persian oversight. Religious and cultural adaptation continued to define Israelite identity in the post-exilic period. The Babylonian exile, therefore, represents both catastrophe and opportunity. It was catastrophic in terms of political sovereignty, territorial loss, and destruction of Jerusalem, yet it was transformative in fostering cultural resilience, religious innovation, literary codification, and spiritual reflection. It demonstrated that national identity could endure without centralized monarchy or territorial control, provided that law, faith, and communal memory were maintained. In summary, the Babylonian exile reshaped Israelite society, religion, and identity. It tested the durability of the covenant, catalyzed theological and literary innovation, and created conditions for the survival of the Israelites as a people and a faith. This period laid the foundation for enduring practices of study, prayer, and law that would define Judaism for millennia. The exile also reinforced lessons about leadership, obedience, resilience, and adaptation, themes that resonate throughout subsequent chapters of Israel's history. The Babylonian exile marks the transition from ancient Israel as a territorial kingdom to Israel as a people defined by faith, law, and collective memory. It highlights how catastrophe can become a crucible for identity, creativity, and endurance, setting the stage for the return to the land, the rebuilding of the temple, and the complex interplay between autonomy and imperial oversight that characterized subsequent centuries. The Second Temple period marks a pivotal chapter in Israelite history, spanning roughly 516 BCE to 70 CE. It begins with the return from the Babylonian exile, the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and the re-establishment of religious and civic life under Persian oversight. This era encompasses profound social, political, and religious transformations, including the emergence of sectarian divisions, interaction with powerful empires, and the evolution of traditions that continue to shape Jewish identity today. The period officially begins with the rebuilding of the temple, completed in 516 BCE under Persian auspices. This second temple replaced the one destroyed by the Babylonians and became the focal point of religious life. The restoration symbolized both continuity and renewal. Continuity of worship practices, sacrificial rituals, and priestly authority. Renewal in the sense that the Israelite community had been reshaped by exile, bringing new interpretations, legal codifications, and religious priorities. The temple represented divine presence, a tangible connection to history, and a unifying institution for the returning exiles. Leadership during this period was shared between priests and governors. Figures such as Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Joshua the high priest oversaw the reconstruction, combining political, administrative, and religious authority. Their leadership ensured coordination between local communities, adherence to Persian administrative requirements, and faithful restoration of religious practices. This dual system of governance, combining civil and religious leadership, became a defining feature of the Second Temple era. The return from Babylon was gradual and partial. Many Jews remained in diaspora communities across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond, fostering the concept that Israelite identity was not solely tied to land. The returnees faced significant challenges, rebuilding the city and temple, re-establishing agricultural production, negotiating with local populations and restoring social cohesion. These challenges required a blend of pragmatism, faith, and strategic planning. For instance, rebuilding Jerusalem's walls under Nehemiah ensured defense against hostile neighbors, while administrative reforms strengthened governance and communal accountability. Religion evolved significantly during the Second Temple period. While sacrificial worship continued, the experience of exile had emphasized study, law, and ethical observance. Texts such as the Torah were compiled, edited, and studied intensively, creating a portable religious identity. Festivals like Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot reinforced collective memory, linking the community to the Exodus, covenant, and land, while adapting practices to the realities of Persian oversight and post-exilic society. The temple functioned as the spiritual heart, but religious life increasingly included synagogues, communal prayer, and scriptural study, innovations that would sustain Jewish practice long after the temple's eventual destruction. Political life during this period was heavily influenced by external empires. Under Persian rule, Judah was a province with limited autonomy, led by governors and priestly authorities. The Persians allowed religious and civic administration to continue, but ultimate authority rested with the imperial bureaucracy. Later, the arrival of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic empires introduced new cultural influences, languages, and political dynamics. Hellenization brought both opportunities in trade, art, and learning, and tensions as traditional practices and religious identity were challenged by foreign customs and governance structures. Socially, the period was marked by stratification and the emergence of distinct groups within the Jewish community. The priests, Kohanim, and Levites retained religious authority, while scribes, elders, and wealthy families gained influence in civic affairs. Ordinary villagers, farmers, and artisans formed the backbone of society. These dynamics led to both cooperation and tension, with disputes over interpretation of law, religious observance, and authority. Sectarian movements, including the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, emerged as communities grappled with questions of purity, law, ritual, and resistance to foreign influence. These sects reflected differing approaches to survival, identity, and religious fidelity. Economically, the Second Temple period saw urban revitalization, agricultural expansion, and integration into regional trade networks. Jerusalem, as the religious and administrative center, attracted pilgrims, merchants, and artisans. Trade extended to Persia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, facilitating economic growth and cultural exchange. Taxation under Persian and later Hellenistic and Roman authorities imposed burdens, but also supported infrastructure, security, and civic organization. Economic stability enabled cultural and religious flourishing, but disparities between wealthy elites and rural populations occasionally fueled social tension. Cultural and intellectual life flourished in tandem with religious development. The editing and codification of sacred texts, coupled with the rise of scribal schools, created a literate and reflective society capable of preserving collective memory. Artistic and architectural innovations, influenced by Persian and Hellenistic styles, appeared in temple renovations, urban planning, and ceremonial objects. Music, poetry, and ritual performance enriched religious observance, while philosophical and ethical discussions shaped communal values. The Second Temple period was thus a time of both adaptation and cultural creativity, balancing continuity with innovation. The period also witnessed growing tension with foreign powers, particularly as the Seleucid Empire gained control over Judea in the 2nd century BCE. Policies promoting Hellenization, including the installation of Greek officials and suppression of traditional practices, sparked resistance. This culminated in the Maccabean Revolt, led by the Hasmonean family, which succeeded in restoring Jewish independence temporarily and rededicating the temple, an event celebrated as Hanukkah. This revolt reinforced the themes of faith, cultural resilience, and the complex interplay between religious and political identity. By the late Second Temple period, Roman influence became dominant. Rome's involvement in Judea introduced new political structures, taxation, and social pressures. The complex web of alliances, puppet kings, and religious authorities created both stability and tension. Economic hardship, cultural pressures, and religious expectations set the stage for social unrest, prophetic critique, and ultimately the seismic events leading to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The Second Temple period was a time of reconstruction, adaptation, and evolution. It saw the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple, the consolidation of religious law and practice, the emergence of sectarian diversity, and integration into imperial systems. Political autonomy fluctuated, but cultural, religious, and social cohesion endured. The period laid the foundations for Jewish identity in diaspora communities, the codification of sacred texts and practices that would survive the destruction of the Second Temple and carry into modern Judaism. The Second Temple period demonstrates the resilience of a people shaped by exile, return, and adaptation to shifting political realities. It is a story of faith, culture, governance, and identity, evolving in the face of external pressures and internal challenges. The foundations laid during this era would influence Jewish thought, ritual, and law for centuries to come, bridging the ancient Israelite kingdoms and the communities that survived in the wake of imperial conquest and displacement. Herod the Great, ruling from 37 BCE to 4 BCE, was the most influential and controversial figure of the Roman period in Judea. Appointed by Rome, he faced the immense challenge of governing a culturally distinct population while maintaining loyalty to the Roman Empire. Herod's Idumean heritage and lack of Davidic lineage caused legitimacy issues, yet his political acumen allowed him to consolidate power, suppress opposition, and navigate the complex tribal, religious, and social divisions within Judea. One of Herod's defining achievements was his architectural and urban projects aimed at both practical governance and political legitimacy. The Second Temple expansion transformed Jerusalem's religious and cultural landscape, creating a monumental center of worship and pilgrimage. He built fortresses such as Masada and Herodium, established the port city, Caesarea Maritima, and improved infrastructure, including roads and aqueducts. These projects bolstered trade, strengthened defenses, and visually reinforced Herod's authority, blending Roman architectural influence with local traditions. Herod's reign was marked by political repression and brutality. To secure power, he executed rivals, including family members and high-ranking officials, instilling fear and ensuring compliance. His reliance on Roman military support and elite allies preserved stability but fueled resentment among ordinary citizens and religious conservatives. Economically, Herod integrated Judea into Roman trade networks, stimulating urban prosperity while maintaining heavy taxation that strained rural communities. Religiously, he maintained the temple and priestly hierarchy, balancing political expediency with religious observance. In short, Herod's legacy is a paradox, a builder of monumental projects and economic growth, yet a ruler defined by cruelty and political manipulation. His reign exemplifies the complex interplay of local tradition, Roman influence, and the challenges of governing a diverse and divided society. The First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Revolt, erupted in 66 CE after decades of tension under Roman rule. Heavy taxation, religious restrictions, and resentment toward Roman-appointed rulers, combined with internal factionalism among Jewish groups, created a volatile environment. The revolt began in Jerusalem, but quickly spread to Judea, Galilee, and beyond, reflecting widespread dissatisfaction with imperial oversight and local corruption. Initially, Jewish rebels achieved significant victories, including the capture of Jerusalem's fortress, Antonia, and parts of the city, demonstrating organizational skill and popular support. However, Rome responded decisively, dispatching legate Vespasian and later Titus with massive forces to quell the rebellion. Roman military tactics combined siege warfare, brutal suppression, and psychological strategies, overwhelming Jewish resistance despite fierce guerrilla actions and the heroism of groups like the Zealots and Sicarii. The Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked the climax after months of starvation, internal strife, and continuous assaults. Roman forces breached the city. The Second Temple, the spiritual and cultural heart of Jewish life, was destroyed, leaving a profound and lasting impact. Sacred artifacts were looted, and survivors were killed, enslaved, or dispersed. This destruction transformed Jewish religious practice, shifting the focus from temple sacrifice to Torah study, prayer, and synagogue-centered life. The war's legacy reshaped Jewish identity and history. It marked the beginning of the diaspora, solidified collective memory around loss and resilience, and underscored the enduring tension between imperial domination and local autonomy. The destruction of the Second Temple became a defining symbol of national catastrophe, spiritual reflection, and the necessity of cultural and religious adaptation. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, 136 CE, was the last major armed Jewish resistance against Roman rule in Judea, sparked by harsh Roman policies, including the planned establishment of a Roman colony over Jerusalem called Aelia Capitolina, and restrictions on Jewish religious practices. The revolt was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many saw as a messianic figure. Bar Kokhba's leadership inspired a broad coalition of Jewish rebels, and initial successes included the recapture of key towns and fortresses in Judea. The revolt showcased sophisticated military tactics, including the use of fortified strongholds, underground tunnels, and guerrilla warfare. Jewish forces demonstrated considerable organization, morale, and determination, temporarily establishing a semi-independent state. Archaeological evidence, such as coins minted by the rebels, inscriptions, and remnants of fortifications, confirms the revolt's scale and ambition. Rome responded with overwhelming force, deploying massive legions under Emperor Hadrian. The campaign was brutal. Entire towns were destroyed, populations massacred, and survivors enslaved or dispersed. Judea was depopulated, villages abandoned, and many communities permanently displaced. The devastation led to the renaming of the region as Syria Palestina, intended to erase Jewish identity and suppress further rebellion. Religiously and culturally, the revolt's failure reinforced a shift away from militarized resistance and temple-centered life, emphasizing scholarship, law, and adaptation in the diaspora. Jewish communities rebuilt identity through synagogues, rabbinic authority, and textual preservation, laying foundations for rabbinic Judaism. The Bar Kokhba revolt stands as a symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and the resilience of Jewish cultural and religious identity in the face of overwhelming oppression. Following the destruction of the Second Temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jewish communities dispersed across the Roman Empire, from Babylon to Alexandria, forming what is historically called the Jewish diaspora. While dispersed geographically, these communities maintained religious, cultural, and legal cohesion through study, ritual, and communal organization. Synagogues emerged as local centers for worship and learning, compensating for the loss of the temple. Diaspora Jews adapted to varied social and political contexts. In Babylon, under Persian and later Parthian rule, Jewish scholars codified oral traditions that became the foundation of the Talmud. In Alexandria, Hellenistic influences fostered philosophical engagement, translation of scriptures into Greek, Septuagint, and participation in urban trade networks. Economic adaptation included roles as merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats, while maintaining distinctive dietary laws, circumcision, and Sabbath observance. Diaspora life required balancing integration and identity preservation. Jews navigated relations with rulers, local populations, and imperial authorities, often facing discrimination, but also finding opportunities for prosperity and influence. Religious innovation was critical. Prayer, study, festivals, and ethical law became central, ensuring continuity of faith without a temple. Culturally, the diaspora strengthened textual traditions, communal governance, and a sense of collective memory. Letters, pilgrimages to Jerusalem, and community correspondence reinforced connection to the homeland. Over centuries, these adaptations allowed Jewish identity to survive and thrive, demonstrating resilience in exile and laying the groundwork for centuries of Jewish cultural, religious, and intellectual life across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. After the destruction of the Second Temple and repeated conflicts with Rome, Jewish life underwent a profound transformation. With the temple gone, sacrificial worship ceased, and religious leadership shifted from priests to scholars and teachers, laying the foundation for rabbinic Judaism. Rabbis became central figures, interpreting scripture, enforcing law, and guiding communities in exile and in the land of Israel. The compilation of oral traditions, eventually codified in the Mishnah, c. 200 CE, provided a comprehensive framework for religious practice, law, and ethics. These texts ensured that Judaism could survive without centralized temple worship, emphasizing prayer, study, ritual observance, and ethical behavior. Synagogues became hubs of learning and community cohesion, providing spaces for teaching Torah, conducting communal rituals, and maintaining identity across the diaspora. Rabbinic Judaism also fostered resilience amid adversity. Communities adapted to local customs while preserving core religious laws and practices such as kosher dietary rules, circumcision, Sabbath observance, and festivals. This adaptability allowed Jews to maintain distinct identity under foreign rule, persecution, and social pressures. Culturally, rabbinic leadership emphasized moral and intellectual engagement, linking religious law to everyday life. Ethical teachings, debates over legal interpretation, and commentary on scripture strengthened communal bonds. Over time, this period produced enduring religious scholarship, spiritual resilience, and a codified legal system that became central to Jewish life for centuries. Rabbinic Judaism represents the shift from temple-centered ritual to a flexible, textually grounded religious identity that could thrive in both homeland and diaspora. From the 4th century CE onward, Jewish communities in the land of Israel and across the Middle East lived under successive empires, including the Byzantine Empire and later the early Islamic caliphates. Byzantine rule imposed Christian dominance, leading to restrictions on synagogue construction, pilgrimage, and Jewish civil rights. Taxes, property limitations, and occasional persecution prompted many Jews to migrate to rural areas or neighboring regions, though important centers persisted in Tiberias, Jerusalem, and Galilee. Under early Islamic rule, 7th to 10th centuries, Jews often experienced greater religious tolerance compared to Byzantine times. Islamic law recognized Jews as people of the book, allowing them to practice their religion, administer community courts, and participate in trade and scholarship under dhimmi status. Jewish communities flourished in urban centers such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Kairouan, producing influential religious and philosophical works, including early commentaries on the Torah and Talmud. Socially and economically, Jews adapted to the dominant cultures while preserving their religious and cultural identity. Trade networks, intellectual exchange, and communal governance allowed diaspora Jews to maintain cohesion. Religious scholarship, legal development, and philosophical engagement thrived, particularly in centers like Babylonian academies, which preserved and expanded the Talmudic tradition. This period illustrates the resilience and adaptability of Jewish communities under foreign rule. Despite fluctuating political conditions, Jews maintained religious continuity, communal organization, and cultural production, ensuring survival and identity preservation across centuries of imperial change. The history of Israel, from its tribal origins to diaspora communities, left a profound cultural and religious legacy. The development of monotheism, law, prophecy, and ethical teaching influenced not only Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam. Texts like the Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and later commentaries codified law, morality, and collective memory, ensuring continuity across centuries of upheaval. Jewish resilience in the face of conquest, exile, and persecution demonstrates the adaptability of culture and identity. Synagogues, scholarship, festivals, and communal governance preserved religious practices and social cohesion even without political sovereignty. Diaspora communities fostered trade, intellectual exchange, and philosophical reflection, linking Jews across continents while maintaining connection to the ancestral homeland. Architectural, artistic, and literary contributions, from temple construction to philosophical texts and biblical translations, reflect a civilization capable of blending tradition with innovation. Festivals like Passover, Hanukkah, and Yom Kippur commemorate historical memory, ethical lessons, and cultural identity, bridging past and present. The enduring legacy of Israel is visible in modern Judaism, cultural identity, and global influence. Religious traditions, ethical frameworks, and historical consciousness continue to shape communities worldwide. The history of Israel, through tribal kingdoms, exile, monarchy, revolt, and diaspora, exemplifies the resilience of a people, the power of law and faith, and the capacity of culture to survive and thrive across millennia. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of the history of Israel and a good night's sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.